We simply don't really have the information that we need. And indeed, for people in Singapore making this risk assessment, they'll make it different from people in Melbourne or people in Washington because you will actually weigh things differently. So these are uncertainties about the way, the problem, how we actually have to manage the risk in this whole process. So what do we do in a state of uncertainty? Again, businesses actually deal with this every day. You have to deal with it. It's no good denying the existence. So what you do is you get on with doing what you can by managing the risk, by retaining a portfolio of activities. That is, don't put all your eggs in one basket because you don't know whether it's the right one, by keeping options open and by regularly reviewing where you're going, your policies. And this applies to governments, it applies to the private sector. So what about the energy sector? Well, as I say, I put this in because with regard to sustainability, it's very important, and in the case of Singapore, which is effectively entirely dependent on the imported energy, the whole issue of sustainability of that supply, the potential risk or of that security of supply is an issue. But it's also an issue for Australia, it's an issue for Western Europe, as the gas and oil fields of the North Atlantic run low. This is the outlook. This is actually what's happened, as indicated by a recent document from the World Energy Authority, which is a very conservative body. It's a body that actually 10 years ago effectively denied that there will be any impact of climate change on the way energy is used. That's changed, which is the good news. But this shows you that if you look at the global situation, most of the expansion in energy use globally has been in coal, which from a climate perspective is in fact the worst approach. But it recognises that countries, in order to build their economies, have actually had to have the energy, and this has been the most opportune way that they can actually achieve that. And in fact, Australia builds a large part of its wealth out of selling that coal internationally. And this shows then a more strategic perspective that says, this is again from a very conservative body, that says, of course, the blue area is the fact that in investments or installations generating energy will eventually die. You know, they become too old and they have to be replaced, and they have to be replaced by more capacity because every population is growing and our demand for energy is growing. And this shows their perspective as to where that growth will come from, and they show that it's clearly the major part of that will be in the loosely called area of renewables, which I'll come back to from the Singapore perspective in a moment. But this is a little bit of background of where we are with the energy situation. The energy sector is particularly impacted by this, and so in Australia it's been the sector that has spent millions and millions of dollars lobbying government to do nothing. And the surprising thing is, in many cases, while they're doing a lot themselves, but they're trying to buy time by influencing the political process in terms of trying to slow down the rate at which we make movements. But they don't want to see taxes, and I'll show you in a moment that we start with a carbon tax from the 1st of July this year. They've lobbied against that, but they don't want a trading scheme, and in fact they're even reluctant to look at energy efficiency, even though in many cases that makes money for them. But from a community perspective, of course it's not the same decision, because from a community perspective we have people who are impacted in agriculture, in water resource production, in protection of natural environment, in tourism and so on, by a changing climate. And so somehow or other governments needs to actually create policy directions that are not just listening to one sector. that are trying to weigh the balance of advantage and disadvantage across a series of sectors. This is not easy because of the segregation that occurs between these different sectors, and again I'll come back to that in a moment. But what we really do need is a more holistic approach to this, and I think it's one of the biggest single advantages that Singapore has. Your size is small, and it means, from everything that I've learned over the last few days I've been here, you're more likely to have your individual components of government, individual departments, working together than we are. They become big and isolated and self-sustaining, and this in a sense doesn't help give you holistic community-wide outcomes. This diagram actually shows now a very long-term perspective, a really strategic perspective. What happens over the next few hundred years? What does it show us? On the right, on the vertical axis, we actually have the global average temperature, and the dotted line going across is the 2-degree target of the European Union that says we don't want to go beyond that because we think it's dangerous. And what the orange line says is this is the best estimate of what will happen to the global average temperature if we peak global emissions by 2015. Not very far off. Do you think that's achievable? I'd like to think it is, but I'm not very confident. And then if we do that, temperatures will peak around about 2065, but then this diagram tells us, because the climate system has enormous inertia, it'll take us centuries to actually move the temperature back down to where it came from. So the orange line, in a way, says that if we can reach that very optimistic target, we can actually do what the European Union wants to do, that is, not exceed 2 degrees. But what it doesn't tell you is that we have uncertainties on that number. And that uncertainty is indicated by the other lines. And so what this suggests is that there's about a 50% chance or more that if we set out to achieve that orange line, we'll actually exceed it. So part of the risk assessment says that all of the policies, including what is clearly one of the more rigorous attempts by the European Union to actually get a number of countries working together on this, we still expose ourselves to a rather large amount of risk. And this slide changes the perspective down differently, and I don't expect you to read all of this because we spent a whole afternoon talking about it. But what it is, it was done originally by McKinsey, the company McKinsey, for Australia. They've done it for several other countries. They may have done it for Singapore, I don't know. But on the axis across the bottom is how much carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, we could save by doing some of these various things. And on the vertical axis, how much money it would cost us per unit of saving that we made. And there are a number of little messages in here that